Welcome. This is the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. If you've been with us before, you know in the last few months we've combined our Living a Revenue Culture podcast with our new partner, TTI Success Insights. So the Revenue Game and TTI come together. And the reason we've come together is because we can solve a much larger problem working together than we can separate. Normally, these podcasts are me interviewing a guest who brings something to all of us to share about how to live a revenue culture. Today, we're going to do a little different. Part of, I think, the value we bring is we bring revenue science and the history of revenue science to organizations who want to live a revenue culture. So today we're going to share some of that revenue science technology, some of the learnings from the last 35 years that hopefully will help it be easier for you to actually achieve living a revenue culture. Now, if you've been with us before, you know what that means is maximizing profit because you've optimized people. The other part of that, there's a third leg to that stool, and that is that to optimize profit, you must have a revenue strategy. You can't just helter-skelter approach revenue and expect to maximize the environment. And when you optimize your people, you're optimizing them based on the purpose, the compelling promise of the revenue strategy to deliver value to solve buyers' unique problems. And what that really means is you're creating a context. You're creating an environment where the revenue strategy comes together with people who are compelled to, actually not only compelled, but they're personally fulfilled by delivering on that purpose that the revenue organization has behind it. And they feel better, they feel part of the picture, and they feel personal satisfaction from transferring value to people who have the problem that your purpose promises to solve. So that's what we're going to talk about today. It's that creating the context so that you can bring in optimized people and not have them disappointed, dismayed, dissuaded, because the organization, the context that they're functioning in is high friction, high anxiety, high chaos. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's kind of break this down and give you some scientific ways to address this. The first one is, we said we're going to maximize profit, and we said we're going to optimize people, but optimizing people only works when they're in a low friction context. If you put really good people, even with a good purpose, in a very bad organization, in an organization that doesn't honor them, doesn't allow them the independence to be creative, innovative, doesn't encourage them to collaborate with others, creates burnout and eventually turnover. If they're in that kind of environment, you're never going to optimize those people, and you're never going to maximize your business. So we're going to talk today about how do you intentionally create that context that works. And of course, the first thing we're going to say is if you understand revenue science, you'll start to understand how to assemble that context. Now, we're not going to get into all of that today, but we're going to point you in the right direction. And then at the end, we're going to suggest, if this is something important to you, that we do have a new book out, Smart Rev, and that'll start you on the path in detail so that you can actually deploy this. When you get to the point that you actually have optimized your people in a context with minimum friction, part of what you're doing is you're increasing the human capacity. Now, when we talk about capacity, this isn't a whip them, make them work harder, more long hours, all the weekends, and stay late. It's not that kind of capacity. It's the capacity for humans to bring to the table their superpower, their innovation, their observation, their curiosity, their ability to collaborate with others, their ability to build on what's there today to create something better for tomorrow. And so this is a whole, we call it a context because when people are in context where they get the opportunity to actually leverage their ideas and their experiences and apply them in real life, that will increase organizational capacity. McKinsey published something recently that said the organizations that function at that higher level, even Standard & Poor's, the ones at the 75th percentile, pretty good, not 100, but 75, they're doing things right. The profitability per employee compared to the people at the mid is 95% more. So same pool of employees, same available technologies, same business schools that everybody graduated from. But when you optimize your people in a good context, those people are 95% more profitable per person. So they didn't work longer hours. They didn't do any kind of crazy things. They just knew how to do it right. So when we talk about increased capacity, we're talking about that's the outcome of optimized people. And you may know I'm a recovering cost accountant. And so when I think about that, what I realize is that the organizations that get that additional 95% capacity for profitable revenue creation, that's really recovering reoccurring capital. Because the people who are not 95% more profitable, they have to go get more capital and invest more capital to go get additional revenue. When you optimize your people, you're optimizing your people to create a lot more revenue without additional capital. So just think about this, that this optimization of people, which leads to maximization of profit, is really like recovering a bunch of capital. And we call it reoccurring capital because every year that you manage your people right and you optimize them, you help them achieve what's important to them while they're helping the organization achieve what's important for the organization. That's recovering reoccurring capital year after year after year. Plus, everybody has a whole lot more fun. So let's dive into this a little bit deeper. Most of us are familiar with Simon Sinek, and many of us have read his book, Start With Why. And he's got a lot of wisdom in that book, much more than just what that one book shares with us. So we're going to pick up on his why. And if you've read the book, he talks about why things happen, how they happen, and then what you do as a result. So we're going to go down that same path. And what people don't often recognize is your business's why or purpose or worthy intention or whatever language you choose to define that strategic value you want to bring to the world. That's where your value comes from. That's where your opportunity for margin, that's where your opportunity for scale all comes from your why. Your why determines the maximum amount of value that you can intentionally deliver to the world. Then how is just, when you say it out loud, it's really simple to recognize. Here's the value we want to transfer. This is our why. Then what's the next logical question? Well, how are you going to do that? Well, are you going to do it through creating software? Are you going to do it through storefronts? Are you going to do it through hiring just immensely smart people? Are you doing it with training? Are you doing it with a global approach? And typically when you have a why, where Steve Jobs' why was to help make a dent in the universe, then how he's going to do that ended up being smartphones, which probably hadn't thought of when he's talked about making a dent in the universe. Watches and computers, of course, and ways to pay bills. And it just goes on and on and on. Those are all hows to help make a dent in the universe, help every individual be their own person, help every individual live the life the way they want to live it. And then you get to the third level, why, how, and then what. Then the what becomes, well, yeah, of course I'm going to have a smartphone to go with my smart watch. And yes, of course I'm going to pay bills that way. But the paying bills is this what that ends up at the bottom. And when you think about one of the huge takeaways from recognizing every conversation you're ever going to have has at least one of these three elements. It's either what are we going to do today, and or it's how we're going to deliver on our why, or why we're here at all. Whichever one of those three conversations you're talking about typically has elements or links to at least one of the other levels. Many conversations start out with why. What's important about our school? What's important about our company? What's important about our church? What's important about our political candidate? And they start with why that is important. And then the next level becomes, well, how are we going to grow our church? How are we going to make sure our church has enough financial backing that it can act on its mission of educating kids or supporting homeless or whatever the purpose of our church is? And then eventually say, well, okay, if that's how we're going to get there, what is it we do tomorrow to start to feed the homeless? So every time you're in a conversation, ask yourself, what is this conversation about? Now, if you want to have disagreements, if you want to have arguments, if you want to have conflict, start talking about what you're going to do. I mean, it's simple things like, well, are we going to start at 8 o'clock or are we going to start at noon? Is the color of the building going to be blue or is it going to be white? When you're at the what level, everybody's got opinions, they know the answer at that what level. And those what level conflicts, almost always, once you get active in those, you get engaged in those, they are typically disconnected from how they're going to help make the why real. So every time you get one of those conflicts where people are arguing about, well, do we start here or do we start there? We do it this way, or who's in charge, or what do we do first? Every time you're there, back that question up to which of those answers, and maybe none of them, is going to advance our why the most. When you stop those conversations and say, this what conversation about, do we start with raising money for the church or finding the location and then raising money? When you link those conversations to how to either of those things advance our why, and if we've already defined how we're going to do this, which of these conversations align to how we have decided to achieve this, that will help us get there the fastest. So the linking of those three levels consciously, intentionally, just changes the game completely. For those of us who are on this call because you're going to live a revenue culture and you're going to maximize your profits, every time you talk to a customer, a buyer, and you allow the conversation to get at the what level, you're just ripping out all your value. Most of us have some degree of thought leadership where we know something the buyer doesn't know, or we can do something the buyer can't do, or we can work with the buyer to accomplish more as a partner than they can possibly accomplish without us. But if we don't link the conversations we're having, like do we prefer Apple or Microsoft? That's a kind of a crazy question, but people argue about that stuff all the time. Do you like Apple phones or do you like, the traditional, other Samsung type phones. Well, how does the phone help make the world better? Does the phone impact our ability to advance how we're going to achieve that why? If it doesn't, quit the conversation. Now, you may have to build some skills of how you change those conversations real time, but you can do that. You can learn how to facilitate that conversation back to a why, because it isn't very hard. So every time you enter into a conversation and you have a why, and if you don't have a why, go get one. Because again, your value comes from your why. Bring that conversation back to why this matters. How does this advance our achievement of our why? And if it doesn't advance our achievement to our why, start over again. Just drop this conversation, come back to it later. The what's you're going to do gets really clear once everybody understands why we're here and how we've agreed to achieve this. Then what we're going to do becomes obvious. If you start with what we're going to do, and then later try and figure out if it aligns with how we agreed to achieve it, or even if it aligns to our why at all, almost never works. So think about it that way. That's a new way for you to think about it. So let's explore this whole concept of how am I going to create a context to achieve living a revenue culture. And the first part is just recognize that every approach to your business, to your life, has those three levels. Why am I here? How am I going to achieve what it is I want to do? And then what do I have to do to make that achievement a reality? The other things to think about is recognize, be able to verbalize, be able to unify yourself and your team around a compelling purpose. When we don't have a purpose, when we're just kind of looking for something to do, we tend not to be very engaged. We tend not to be very committed. We tend not to be very serious about getting someplace. Then we really argue about what we're going to do because we have no idea where we're going. So get clear. All of us have things that really compel us. And when you can describe those and you can share those, one sentence is enough words. With other people, it's amazing how many other people either share the same compelling why or they respect it. And they go, wow, I think it's really important. I don't know how to do it. And I'm committed to a couple other things, but gosh, I hope where you're going, you get there because that's really important. So when you can start out with a compelling purpose, you're going to quickly see the world will stack up in kind of three general categories. One, there'll be a whole bunch of people. You'll be surprised how many will be as compelled about what you want to do as you are. There'll be another group. The second group is people who will absolutely respect and admire your purpose. I think teachers, what they do is spectacular. I don't think I could ever do that, but I will do almost anything I can to support people to do a better and better and better job educating our children and our adults. And then the third group is those people who they don't really care. They don't have to be negative. It's just not interesting. So recognize that once you have a purpose, now it starts to get easy to figure out how you're going to, whether you use the term partner or collaborate or team with other people. So always, always, always start with purpose, make it as concise as you can, and help people decide how they play in your world. The second thing is when you've got a purpose, you've got a why, you've got a mission, whatever term you want to use, a worthy intention. Often we'll put a team together and we'll say, wow, this is really important. We've got this new idea for a company, or we're going to build a private school or a church, or going to set up a whole new playground system. Once you have that compelling purpose, too often what we do is we jump from that high level purpose to what are we going to do? Who's going to go raise money? Who's going to be our first employee? What kind of office space do we need? And when we do that, we give up leverage. And that's what we call random or chaotic way to start to execute. All those terms, what office space are we going to get? What computer systems? Those are execution questions. And execution is really, really important. We all know the famous statements about, execution eats strategy for lunch. That's kind of true. But what they completely omit most of the time is there's that level in between. In that Simon Sinek conversation of why, how, what, how is that level in between? In a business world, how is, what's our message? What is our brand promise? What are principles that we do business around? In order to accomplish what we need to accomplish, what structure is required? That could be software, it could be offices, it could be training. There's hundreds of things that the structure could be, but the purpose of the structure is to start to execute the why. So when you think about, we have our why and we often just jump. Companies will create a budget for the year and they say, we're going to grow 11%, sales and marketing, go make it so. Well, really, you also need to know, well, what's my budget? Who's in charge? Which markets are we going to do this in? Which ideal customers are we going to approach? Are we going to do this as a product vendor, a service vendor, a combination of product and service? Are we going to charge as a subscription or whatever those structure pieces are? When we don't have structure, it makes it very, very difficult for people to execute. No matter how good the people you hire are at execution, they can never execute better than the structure that supports them. So as you think about this, recognize what your why is, what the achievement you're trying to accomplish with your business, then build the minimum structure. When people talk about MVPs, minimal viable product, they should be talking about what's the minimum viable structure we need in place so regular humans can go execute. So keep that middle level, that how in play. The third thing we want to talk about is, and if you've read the Smart Rev book, you know about this, you already know, avoid dumb stuff. And dumb stuff, a good example of what we've been talking about is you start with what? You start with saying, this is what we're going to do. And you haven't really even defined why you're going to do it or what's the structure in the middle. Lots of what we think is true in the world of revenue is truly a myth. There's lots of stuff that we think is a good idea that isn't a good idea. And, one of them is make 100 cold calls a day and, everybody is a good customer and always be closing and work on wallet share and go make a pitch. Every one of those is a myth. And myths in revenue science are partially true evidence. So you need to understand what each of those are and make sure they're not part of your culture. Make sure they're not part of that deployable structure, that how level. Because if you do the how level right, none of those things will be part of your execution. So get the dumb stuff out. That removes chaos and it will create more highly leveraged business. When you design that how level, you're thinking about scale. And every time you invest in that how level, ask yourself the question, what's the leverage? And sometimes leverage is positive. We do something really good and we get more money back than we invested. But too often leverage is negative. We invest money and we actually end up worse off. So try to answer the question of what's the leverage you expect before you invest, and then measure it after you've invested so that you learn something. If you learned it was a really good investment, now go do more. And if it was a bad investment, ask yourself the question, can it be fixed? Or should I just make sure I never do it again? So then the next one, and this is kind of new, this fourth thing when you're building your context to think about, and that is there's new data for us to look at. For the most part, organizations are not very good at data. We consider data to be our profit and loss statement. We consider data to be our personal commission based off our quota. We think of data in a rear view mirror, outcome base, and most of the time it's not helpful in figuring out what we're going to do next. Almost all of the time, the data is not really linked to the human beings. It might be linked to their activity, but it's not linked to the human being. And if you remember our conversation a few minutes ago about the importance of optimizing the people, if we really want to optimize people, we should think about people in the same way. I was in manufacturing for years. We used to think about assembly lines. And so we would match machines and robots and software to an assembly line to make it as low friction, high throughput, lowest maintenance that we could possibly do. And that's machines. But we almost never do that kind of thinking with people. We don't use psychometric data. And there's a new thing called growth insight data that helps us beforehand, in advance, recognize how do I create the optimal team? How do I assign people to supervisors where they're going to get along really, really, really well? And we're 90% sure of that before we assign them. You know, how do we make sure that people are in a career track that is really fulfilling for the individual and helps us get succession planning in place so that when we need that next new general manager, we've got the right person who wants to do it ready to go. So this fourth context piece I'm going to challenge you for is get this new data. It's this combination of psychometric and growth insight data so that you can combine human talent and human their compelling whys, what fulfills them, and it ties them with the purpose of the business and the roles in the business that need to be fulfilled to create maximum capacity. You know, as we go forward, that's what we think of as optimized people. They're in the right place for the right reasons. Careers are matched to the organization's long-term strategy, and everybody's getting the most out of the scenario they possibly can. And then fifth, use a common view of leveraged context to lead individuals and organizations to achieve and sustain. That's living a revenue culture. We often don't think about leverage, and we talked about it a couple of minutes ago, but we just think, well, if we go do this and we hit our KPI, that individual KPI for our department may be really nice, but it doesn't mean that KPI helped us create leverage in the organization. So one of the things going forward, you know, we just said in number 4 is get that data that combines psychometric and growth insights data and align that to operational both needs and outcomes. Now we're saying when you combine those things, ask yourself the question, what's the leverage from putting these things together? Because sometimes we think it's a good idea to go to a trade show. We think because we'll get, 500 people come to our booth, that's a good idea. I will tell you that most of the time, if you actually measure that, what you'll find is you get negative leverage. You're actually worse off for the investment in the trade show than if you had not done it. And if you spend 50 grand on a trade show and you find out afterwards, or even couldn't know it beforehand, that 50,000 made my business $75,000 worse, than if I hadn't invested that 50. Then your question becomes, wow, if I'm really wanting to invest 50,000, what else could I do that would actually create positive leverage? So that discipline to ask these leverage questions before you make the investment, then measure the outcome, and then ask yourself the question, when I get to the next situation that's similar, how can I make a decision based on probable leverage so that every time I'm investing time or money or technology into something up front, I'm predicting the amount of leverage, and then this is a why, how, what. Why are we doing the trade show? Oh, I know why we're doing it. Now, how do we make sure that that 50,000 has positive leverage? And then review what we did and figure out how we tweak it the next time or decide we'll never do it again. So those are, 5 things for us to think about. Have that compelling purpose, be really clear about that deployable structure. That's really based on your 5 revenue strategy questions. Number 3, it's, use the revenue science to avoid dumb stuff. And number 4, it's that combination of the psychometric and growth insights data. And number 5, take those first 4 to create positive leverage. Because in the future, there's going to be less capital around. The capital that is around is going to be more expensive. So when you got expensive capital, you better get good leverage in it. So that gets us a start on this. And we'll go deeper into some of these in future podcasts. But the way you can advance yourself today, because we're really creating a community around how to live this revenue culture. And one of the ways, if this is interesting and you really want to achieve this, I mentioned earlier, we've got the book out, Smart Rev, and get the book. And I've written 2 bad books. This is the 3rd one, and it's really pretty good. And read it and start to apply it to your world, and then become part of our Smart Rev community. And there's lots of ways to do that. Part of it's this podcast. Part of it is you can get certified in Smart Rev. We have ongoing mastermind groups in Smart Rev. There's lots of ways to get you involved in this. But if you've decided that you want to create this new revenue model, we'd love to have you as part of our team. So you can find the book on Amazon. You can find us in another podcast in the next few weeks. We got lots of podcasts that are already out there. And if there's anything specific I can do, reach out. We'll be glad to talk to you. Thanks for joining us today.